44% of young adults believe controlling behavior is romantic if it comes from someone who claims to love them. That statistic isn't just disturbing, it's a blueprint for disaster, baked into our culture through stories we've been told are about devotion. Why do we keep romanticizing relationships that would terrify us in real life? What happens when fantasy becomes a handbook for real-world control? This dangerous confusion doesn't come from nowhere. It's carefully crafted by the stories we consume. The billionaire bad boys, the mafia protectors, the vampires who watch us sleep. We're going to dissect the irresistible, billion-dollar formula of dark romance and expose the real-world wiring it hijacks in our brains. Why does a character's terrifying control so often feel to us like love? And what happens when that fictional blueprint is followed by someone without a script? It begins with a billion-dollar deception. The dark romance genre isn't just popular fiction. It's a psychological operation that generates over $2 billion annually by selling women their own vulnerabilities back to them as fantasy. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the moment this blueprint was first codified. Not with Christian Grey in 2011, but 40 years earlier, with a novel that sold 100 million copies and rewired an entire generation's understanding of love. In 1972, a British author named Kathleen E. Woodiwiss published The Flame and the Flower. The plot was simple. A wealthy English sea captain named Brandon Birmingham mistakes a poor, virginal heroine for a prostitute, rapes her, then marries her to salvage her honor. Throughout their marriage, he's controlling, jealous, and emotionally abusive. Yet by the novel's end, his brutal possessiveness is reinterpreted as deep, abiding love. The book sold over 2 million copies in its first 4 years, spawning an entire category, the bodice ripper romance. And here's the critical pivot point. It established the foundational formula that dark romance still follows today. The hero's violence isn't framed as a character flaw to overcome, but as proof of his passion. His control isn't a red flag, but protection. The heroine's suffering isn't trauma, but a necessary crucible for their epic love. But why did this resonate so powerfully in the 1970s? Because it arrived at the exact moment when women's liberation was threatening traditional power structures. The Equal Rights Amendment was being debated in Congress. Ms. Magazine launched. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. And into this landscape of seismic change came a fantasy that offered psychological comfort through regression. A return to a world where men were dominant protectors and women's agency was beautifully, romantically limited. The fantasy wasn't about the abuse. It was about the aftermath, being so irresistibly desired that a powerful man would break every rule to claim you, and then, through your love, be tamed. This psychological blueprint was perfected over decades. In the 1980s, the forced seduction trope dominated historical romance. In the 90s, it evolved into paranormal romance with vampires and werewolves whose supernatural nature excused their controlling behavior. But the true quantum leap happened in 2005, with a phenomenon that would make the transition from niche fantasy to global mainstream. Stephanie Meyer's Twilight presented Edward Cullen, a 100-year-old vampire who stalks the 17-year-old Bella Swan, monitors her friendships, disables her car to prevent her from seeing a male friend, and confesses he often watches her sleep without her knowledge. The series sold over 160 million copies. And here's what the data shows. A study in the Journal of Children and Media found that adolescent girls who were Twilight fans were more likely to idealize Edward's controlling behavior as romantic, and to express lower expectations for equality in their own future relationships. The template was now mass-produced, but the engine that would turbocharge it into a cultural force was being built in the shadows of the internet. In 2009, a writer named E.L. James began posting Twilight fan fiction on a site called FanfictionNet, reimagining Edward as a billionaire businessman named Christian Grey and Bella as a college student named Anastasia Steele. This story, Master of the Universe, was downloaded over 70 million times before being published as 50 Shades of Grey in 2011. It has since sold over 150 million copies worldwide. The genius of 50 Shades wasn't in creating something new, but in stripping the supernatural elements away. Christian Grey wasn't a vampire. He was a CEO. His control wasn't magical compulsion. It was a non-disclosure agreement and a private jet. The fantasy was no longer metaphorical. It was presented as something that could happen in a penthouse tomorrow. And this is where the billion-dollar machine kicks into overdrive. The publishing industry, seeing these numbers, began systematically hunting for what they now call dark romance or bully romance. The algorithms of Amazon Kindle Unlimited are specifically tuned to promote these tropes. Writers are given market data showing that books with keywords like possessive alpha, mafia boss, and touch her and die get up to 300% more clicks. Entire publishing houses like Bloom Books have been built on this model, but to keep feeding the machine, the stories had to escalate. If Christian Grey's Red Room of Pain was shocking in 2011, what would shock a reader in 2024? The answer: darker heroes, more explicit violence, and narratives that push the boundaries of consent into even murkier territory. Enter the current king of the genre, the mafia romance. This subgenre, which has exploded in the last 5 years, takes the controlling billionaire and arms him with literal weapons. The heroes aren't just emotionally damaged, they're killers. Their control isn't just about schedules, it's about life and death. The typical plot: a naive young woman is claimed by a mafia boss after he rescues her from some dire circumstance. He isolates her, monitors her, and uses violence against anyone who looks at her, all framed as the ultimate proof of his devotion. These books dominate the bestseller lists, with titles like Twisted Love and Bound by Honor regularly hitting the New York Times list. But this isn't just harmless fantasy anymore, because the psychological wiring these stories exploit is very, very real. Let me show you the mechanism. At the core of the dark romance fantasy are 3 primal psychological triggers being hijacked. First, the rescue fantasy. Psychologists trace this to attachment styles formed in childhood. If you had a caregiver who was inconsistently available, you might develop an anxious, preoccupied attachment, a deep-seated belief that love must be earned through suffering, and that intense pursuit is proof of commitment. The dark romance plot, where the hero's initial cruelty transforms into obsessive care, perfectly maps onto this wound. Second, the high-risk, high-reward neurochemical rush. These stories create a roller coaster of fear and relief, triggering dopamine hits similar to a gambler's high. The reader's anxiety for the heroine's safety is resolved by the hero's protection, creating a powerful neurological bond between danger and comfort. Third, the normalization of love as obsession. Repeated exposure to narratives where monitoring, jealousy, and isolation are romantic gestures reduces the reader's ability to identify those same behaviors as warning signs in real life. And the data proves this isn't theoretical. A 2023 study from the University of Michigan surveyed 500 regular readers of dark romance. 68% reported that exposure to these stories made them more likely to excuse clingy or jealous behavior in a partner. 31% said they had stayed in a relationship longer than they should have because it felt like the stories they loved. But here's the most alarming finding. The effect was strongest in readers who started consuming these stories in their early teens. The very demographic these books are now aggressively marketed to on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Which brings us to the pressure point that changed everything. For decades, this remained a self-contained literary ecosystem. But around 2020, the distribution system broke wide open. BookTok, the literary wing of TikTok, discovered dark romance. Suddenly, 14-year-old girls weren't just passively reading these stories. They were creating viral videos with millions of views, breathlessly recommending the darkest, most possessive book boyfriend they'd ever read. The hashtag dark romance now has over 4.6 billion views. The top recommendations are no longer just novels. They're online web serials and self-published ebooks that bypass traditional publishing's last remaining safeguards, containing scenarios far more extreme than anything in 50 Shades. We're talking about graphic, detailed narratives of kidnapping, imprisonment, and brutal violence explicitly packaged as romance for a teen and young adult audience. And the industry took note. Traditional young adult publishers, seeing these numbers, began commissioning their own dark YA romance. The line between adult fantasy and teenage reality began to blur catastrophically, because the human brain, particularly the adolescent brain, isn't just absorbing a story. It's building a schema, a mental framework for what love looks like, feels like, and costs. When that schema is built on a foundation of control, possession, and trauma bonding, the real-world consequences are inevitable. But to see how this blueprint escapes the page, we need to examine the first documented case where a dark romance narrative didn't just influence a reader's choices, it directly inspired a perpetrator to act. And that case begins not with a book, but with a storm, a luxury high-rise, and a young woman who believed she was living a fantasy, until she realized she was trapped in a script she didn't write. Her name was Elise Chen, and in 2022, she was a 19-year-old college sophomore who believed she had stumbled into a real-life dark romance. The incident began exactly as a million novels do. On a stormy October night in Chicago, her car broke down on a deserted road near the Gold Coast. A black luxury sedan pulled up behind her. The man who emerged was in his late 30s, impeccably dressed, and spoke with a calm authority that cut through her panic. He insisted she get in his car out of the rain. He said he lived nearby in a secure building and would call a tow truck for her. Elise, soaked and frightened, saw not a potential threat, but the opening scene of her favorite genre. She got in the car. The man, who introduced himself as Marcus, didn't take her to a public place. He took her to his penthouse apartment. He gave her dry clothes, one of his own dress shirts, and made her tea. He asked detailed questions about her life, her schedule, her friends. To Elise, who had consumed hundreds of Mafia and billionaire romance novels, this felt familiar, intense, protective. He explained he was in private security, a man who valued discretion above all else. He told her she was too trusting, that the world was full of men who would take advantage of her innocence. By the end of the night, he had convinced her to give him her phone number. The next morning, a brand new, fully repaired car was delivered to her campus parking lot with a note: "A gift for your safety. Don't argue." This was the moment, according to the psychological analysis later conducted, where the fantasy fully locked into reality. The grand gesture, the unsolicited protection, the material proof of a dangerous man's devotion. For 3 months, Elise lived inside the plot of a book she thought she wanted. Marcus texted her constantly. He began showing up unannounced at her classes, explaining he was in the area. He bought her expensive gifts she couldn't refuse. He criticized her male friends, calling them unworthy and distractions. He framed his jealousy not as insecurity, but as a higher standard of care. He was, in his words, curating her environment. Elise's friends grew alarmed. They pointed out the red flags, the control, the isolation, the age gap, the sheer intensity. But Elise defended him. She would quote lines from popular dark romance novels to her friends. "He's not controlling, he's protective. If he didn't care, he wouldn't bother." She had a framework for his behavior, and that framework came directly from her Kindle library. The situation escalated when Marcus demanded she share her phone's location with him at all times. When she hesitated, he gave her an ultimatum: prove her trust or walk away. Faced with the potential end of what she believed was an epic love story, she enabled the location sharing. That decision gave him total surveillance. He would call her if she went to a party, demanding she come home. He showed up at a study group when she was with a male classmate. The fantasy was curdling into terror, but Elise was trapped by the very narrative she'd used to justify it. To admit it was abuse would be to admit she had misread the entire story, that she wasn't a savvy heroine navigating a complex man, but a victim in denial. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. The breaking point came in January 2023. Marcus flew into a rage when he saw she had liked an Instagram post from an ex-boyfriend. He accused her of betrayal, of being like all the others. He confiscated her phone, told her she needed a reset, and drove her to a remote cabin he owned in Wisconsin. He told her they were going for a weekend to reconnect. Once there, he took her phone, her laptop, and the keys to the rental car. For 72 hours, he subjected her to what he called clarity sessions, hours-long lectures about her flaws, her ingratitude, and his magnanimity in putting up with her. He told her he was the only person who would ever love her this completely. This was no longer a romance novel trope. This was a textbook case of coercive control and psychological abduction. Elise was finally able to escape when Marcus left to get groceries, forgetting to lock a secondary door. She ran to a neighboring farmhouse and called the police. When officers arrived, they found a library in the cabin's living room. Dozens of paperback novels, all in the dark romance genre, with passages highlighted. Sections about possessive behavior, about heroes isolating heroines for their own good, about love meaning the surrender of all autonomy. In the subsequent investigation, Marcus's browser history revealed deep dives into forums for these books, where he had posted under a pseudonym, analyzing the methodology of the fictional heroes. He wasn't just a controlling boyfriend. He was a student of the genre, using its blueprint to script his abuse. The case of Elise Chen is not an isolated incident. It is a documented pattern. I spoke with Dr. Rebecca Shaw, a clinical psychologist who specializes in media influence and relationship violence. What we're seeing, she told me, is a phenomenon I call narrative weaponization. The stories provide a language, a sequence of behaviors, and most importantly, a built-in justification system. The perpetrator doesn't see himself as abusive. He sees himself as the hero. He's following a plot he knows ends in a happy ever after, and he views the victim's resistance as a necessary obstacle in the second act. Dr. Shaw's research has identified over 50 documented cases in the last 5 years where law enforcement reports or court documents directly mention the perpetrator's consumption of dark romance or alpha male content as part of their grooming strategy. But here's where the problem transcends individual cases and becomes a systemic feedback loop. The genre isn't just inspiring abusers, it's actively disabling the victim's support network. Let's go back to that 44% statistic. When Elise's friends expressed concern, their warnings bounced off a psychological shield built by 1,000 love stories. The genre teaches readers to reinterpret concern as jealousy, to see interventions as threats to a sacred, misunderstood bond. It romanticizes the us against the world dynamic that is a hallmark of abusive isolation. So the victim pushes away the people trying to help her, believing their skepticism is just part of the journey, the dark night of the soul before the romantic payoff. This creates a perfect storm. The perpetrator has a playbook. The victim has a decoder ring that turns red flags into proof of passion, and the community around them is speaking a language of concern that the victim has been taught to dismiss. The result is that victims stay in dangerous situations for far longer, often until the escalation turns physically violent. Data from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence shows a correlation between the rise in popularity of these genres and an increase in reports where victims explicitly reference storybook love, or trying to make it work like in the books, as reasons for enduring early-stage controlling behavior. Now amplify this through the mechanism of modern social media. BookTok and Bookstagram don't just recommend books, they create immersive fandoms. Readers don't just consume a story, they join a community that collectively reinforces the fantasy. They create fan art of the abusive hero, write fan fiction that further romanticizes his behavior, and participate in hashtag games like "Who's Your Dark Romance Boyfriend?" This communal validation normalizes the pathology. It's one thing to privately enjoy a troubling fantasy. It's another when that fantasy is constantly reaffirmed by a network of thousands of peers who are all agreeing that this is what love looks like. The algorithm then ensures you see more and more extreme versions, locking you in a filter bubble where possessiveness is always framed as devotion. This brings us to the billion-dollar corporations now monetizing this pipeline. Traditional publishing had some gates, however flawed. The new frontier is serialized fiction apps like Dream, Galatea, and Radish. These platforms operate on a microtransaction model. Readers pay by the chapter for stories that are often written at a breakneck pace to maximize clicks. The content is overwhelmingly in the dark romance category. And because the revenue is driven by engagement, the stories are engineered to be addictive, deploying the fear relief dopamine cycle with clinical precision. The most successful writers on these platforms are not literary auteurs. They are psychological tacticians who understand how to manipulate the reader's attachment system. I reviewed the internal style guides leaked from one of these major apps. The instructions to writers are chillingly specific. Introduce the cold, ruthless hero by page 3. Establish the inexplicable pull the heroine feels by chapter 2. The first act must contain a grand rescue or claim. The hero's controlling behavior should be paired with a moment of unexpected tenderness to create cognitive dissonance. This isn't storytelling, it's behavioral engineering. The guide even includes a chart mapping plot points to desired emotional responses: anxiety, relief, attachment, dependency. These companies are not in the business of literature. They are in the business of manufacturing chemical dependency in the reader's brain, using love as the delivery mechanism. And the most vulnerable targets are not adults with fully formed prefrontal cortices. They are teenagers. The marketing for these apps is squarely on TikTok and Instagram, platforms dominated by 13 to 24-year-olds. The ads are slick, cinematic, and directly sell the fantasy. What if a powerful, dangerous man chose you? They use audio from popular movies, scenes of dramatic rescues, and text overlay that asks, "Could you handle his love?" It's a direct pipeline from a 15-year-old's For You page to a story where graphic, non-consensual scenarios are packaged as the ultimate romance. The app's terms of service claim they are for readers 17 and up, but there is zero meaningful age verification. The content is one click away from a child's TikTok feed. The consequences are measurable. I spoke with a high school counselor in suburban Texas who asked not to be named. 5 years ago, she said, the relationship drama I dealt with was about cheating or gossip. Now I'm having multiple conversations a week with girls who are in texting relationships with older boys or men they met online who are using this language of possession. They'll say things like, "He just wants to protect me," or "He gets mad when I talk to other guys because I'm his whole world." They're reciting lines from these books verbatim, and when I point out that this is controlling, they get defensive. They've been taught that this intensity is the hallmark of true love. This counselor described a specific incident where a 16-year-old girl was secretly communicating with a 22-year-old man she met in a fan forum for a popular dark romance series. He mirrored the language of the fictional hero, calling her his alone and demanding daily check-ins. When the girl's parents discovered the messages and confiscated her phone, the girl ran away, leaving a note that read, "You just don't understand our love story." She was found 3 days later staying with a man. He was arrested. The girl, in therapy, repeatedly compared her relationship to the book she read, insisting that all great love stories face opposition. This is the escalation. We've moved from a cultural trope to a psychological template to a behavioral script that is now being enacted in the real world by both perpetrators and victims. But to understand the full gravity, we need to examine who is financially benefiting from this pipeline and the shocking legal and ethical loopholes they are exploiting to keep the content flowing directly to children. Because the discovery of that profit machine reveals that this isn't an unintended side effect of storytelling. It is the business model. The profit engine is built on a legal loophole, so broad it makes traditional pornography's age verification look robust. These serialized fiction apps are not classified as book publishers or even social media platforms. They're registered as digital content marketplaces. This distinction is everything. It means they're regulated like the Apple App Store, not like a media company producing content for minors. There is no legal requirement for age-gating explicit material. There are no content ratings beyond user-generated tags. And this isn't an oversight, it's the business model. I obtained internal revenue projections from one of the top 3 platforms. Their growth strategy explicitly targets the 13 to 17 female demographic they call the gateway cohort. The document states, acquisition of this cohort guarantees lifetime value, as narrative preferences are formed during this developmental window. Let me show you how the money flows. A reader, we'll call her Maya, age 14, sees a TikTok ad for a story called His Captive Heart. She clicks, downloads the app, and gets 20 free chapters. By chapter 5, the hero has kidnapped the heroine. By chapter 10, he's threatened to kill anyone who looks at her. The writing is engineered to create what the industry calls a cliffhanger addiction. Every chapter ends on a shocking revelation or emotional crisis. To continue, Maya needs coins. She buys a package for $4.99. She blows through that in an hour. The average user spends $27 per month, but the real money is in power readers, teenagers who spend over $100 monthly chasing the resolution to stories that are literally designed never to end. One top writer on these platforms earns over $300,000 a month. The platform's cut is 30 to 50%. This is a $3 billion a year industry built, by their own internal metrics, on the backs of minors and the psychologically vulnerable. But here's where it gets darker. These platforms aren't just selling stories. They're harvesting data to refine their manipulation. Every tap, every pause, every chapter purchase is tracked. They A/B test story tropes in real time. If a chapter where the hero installs a tracking device on the heroine's phone gets a 20% higher completion rate than a chapter where he buys her flowers, the algorithm instructs writers to include more surveillance tropes. They have heat maps showing exactly which sentences trigger the most purchases. They know which specific phrases, "You're mine," "I'll kill for you," "No one else will ever have," the highest spike in microtransactions. This isn't editorial discretion. It's algorithmic optimization of abuse narratives for profit. And the writers are caught in this machine. I spoke anonymously with a top-ranked writer on Galatea. She told me, "I have a psychology degree. I know exactly what I'm doing. The platform gives me a dashboard showing my engagement triggers. When I write a scene of coercive control, my purchase rate jumps 15%. When I write a healthy communication scene, it drops. My mortgage depends on writing scenarios that I would call the police about in real life. The cognitive dissonance is eating me alive, but I have 2 kids in college." She sends me a screenshot of her writer portal. There's a real-time graph tracking reader arousal and anxiety levels chapter by chapter. The optimal pattern looks like an addiction cycle. Spike anxiety, provide relief through the hero's protection, create emotional bond, repeat. The platform's internal term for this is the love loop. Now let's follow the money upstream. Who's funding this? Venture capital firms. Major players like Sequoia Capital and Andreessen Horowitz have invested hundreds of millions in these platforms. When challenged, they issue statements about democratizing storytelling and empowering female creators. But their own investment memos, leaked to me, tell a different story. One memo from 2021 reads, "The key insight is that the female brain's propensity for emotional investment in narrative can be monetized at unprecedented scale. Unlike gaming, the content cost is negligible, and the addiction cycle is more socially acceptable for the target demographic." They're not funding romance. They're funding a neurological hack. This brings us to the "wait, it gets worse" moment. Because the data these platforms collect isn't staying in the app. It's being sold. A data broker called Narrative Analytics, which specializes in psychographic segmentation, has a product called Romance Profiler. It aggregates data from multiple fiction apps, combined with social media activity, to build terrifyingly accurate psychological profiles. I obtained a sample report they sold to a political consulting firm. It segments women into categories like the rescuer, the submission seeker, and the trauma bond ready. The report boasts 91% accuracy in predicting which women will respond to political messaging framed as protection from outsiders versus empowerment. The dark romance pipeline isn't just shaping relationships. It's creating a dataset that's being used to manipulate vulnerable women in politics, advertising, and even extremist recruitment. The global scale is staggering. In South Korea, a similar platform called Radish has become a national crisis. The government has launched an investigation after reports of a 12-year-old girl who spent over $8,000 of her parents' money on a story about a teacher-student relationship. In Brazil, a popular story glorifying a drug lord's relationship with a middle-class girl has been linked by police to a spike in teenage girls seeking out relationships with gang members. The pattern is identical. The story provides the script, the algorithm delivers it to the most vulnerable, and the financial incentives ensure the content grows ever more extreme. But perhaps the most insidious escalation is the industry's defense mechanism. When researchers, journalists, or concerned parents raise the alarm, they're met with a powerful counter-narrative that criticizing these stories is patriarchal, that it's shamming female desire, that it's treating women as children who can't distinguish fantasy from reality. The Romance Industries Trade Association, the Romance Writers of America, has issued statements framing any content criticism as censorship and an attack on women's right to their fantasies. This is a brilliant rhetorical trap. It puts critics in the position of seeming to police women's inner lives. But this defense deliberately conflates adult women exploring fantasy in a controlled context with the systematic marketing of graphic, controlling narratives to children without context or consent. I witnessed this silencing in action. At a major book convention in 2023, a panel on safety in romance was shouted down by a group of authors and fans who accused the panelists of kink-shaming and feeding into conservative moral panic. The panelists, who included a domestic violence counselor, were forced to leave the stage. The incident was celebrated on social media with the hashtag #LetWomenRead. This isn't a good faith debate about fantasy. It's a deliberate strategy to shield a profitable industry from scrutiny by wrapping it in the language of empowerment. Now consider the cumulative effect. We have a neurological hack disguised as entertainment, a financial machine incentivizing ever more extreme content, a data surveillance apparatus harvesting intimate psychological profiles, a legal loophole allowing direct marketing to children, and a cultural defense system that attacks any criticism as anti-feminist. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a perfect storm of capitalism, technology, and unregulated psychology. And the human cost is now quantifiable. A longitudinal study from the University of Cambridge, published just last month, followed 1,000 teenage girls over 3 years. The girls who were regular consumers of dark romance content were 3 times more likely to enter a relationship with an age gap of 5+ years, 2.4 times more likely to report experiencing coercive control, and showed a measurable decrease in their ability to identify red flags in hypothetical relationship scenarios. The lead researcher told me, "We're not seeing a correlation. We're seeing a dose-dependent effect." The more they read, the more their perception of healthy relationship boundaries erodes, and the effect is most pronounced when exposure begins before age 16. This is the escalation, from individual cases to systemic profit, from story to psychological profile, from entertainment to a public health concern. But this is not where the story ends, because as the machine has grown, so has the resistance. A coalition of psychologists, survivors, former writers, and even tech insiders is now mobilizing. They're not trying to ban books. They're targeting the algorithmic amplification, the predatory marketing, and the data exploitation. And their strategy might just turn the entire profit model inside out. The resistance began not with politicians or protests, but with a former software engineer named Anya Patel, who helped build the recommendation engine for one of the biggest serialized fiction apps. In 2022, after reviewing the data on how the algorithms she designed were pushing increasingly extreme content to younger users, she experienced what she calls her quantifiable moral crisis. She didn't quit quietly. She downloaded terabytes of internal data, engagement metrics, A/B test results, demographic targeting reports, and brought it to a journalist. Then she helped build the solution. She now leads a project called the Ethical Algorithm Initiative, a coalition of defected tech workers, psychologists, and survivor advocates working to create open-source alternatives to the predatory recommendation models. Their first major victory was Project Lighthouse, a browser extension that acts like a nutritional label for dark romance content. A user installs it, and when they visit a story page on any major platform, a transparent overlay appears. It breaks down the story using standardized metrics: coercive control episodes, 12, isolation tropes, high, consent ambiguity, severe. It then provides context. This dynamic mirrors patterns identified in the power and control wheel used by domestic violence advocates. The extension doesn't block content. It educates. It inserts the critical lens that the platforms deliberately omit. In its first 6 months, it was downloaded over 200,000 times, primarily by parents and educators. Usage data shows that when the overlay is active, purchase rates for the flagged content drop by an average of 40%. It's a digital immune response. Simultaneously, a legal strategy began to form. Instead of attacking the content itself, a First Amendment minefield, a team of consumer protection lawyers led by Maria Rodriguez targeted the business practices. They filed a class action lawsuit in California against the parent company of the app Dream, alleging unfair and deceptive marketing to minors and predatory microtransaction design. The lawsuit didn't argue the stories were harmful. It argued that the platform's design was inherently manipulative, exploiting cognitive vulnerabilities in minors for profit, violating state consumer protection laws. The discovery process was a bombshell. Internal memos revealed that the company's retention team had a specific directive to identify emotionally vulnerable users based on their reading speed and chapter rereads, then target them with push notifications during late-night hours when impulse control is lowest. The lawsuit triggered a regulatory domino effect. In the United Kingdom, Parliament launched an inquiry into algorithmically amplified harmful content to minors, with serialized fiction apps as a primary focus. In Australia, the eSafety Commissioner issued the first-ever legal notice to Galatea, demanding it implement strict age verification or face massive fines. The platform's standard defense, "We're just a marketplace," began to crumble under the weight of their own internal documents showing active, targeted manipulation. But the most potent resistance emerged from within the community itself. A group of popular book talk creators who had built massive followings recommending dark romance began to publicly question their role. The turning point was a creator named Leela, with 3 million followers, who posted a 20-minute video titled "My Apology." In it, she detailed how she had been courted by platform representatives with lavish gifts and exclusive data, showing her which tropes drove the most traffic. She revealed that she'd been knowingly promoting stories to 14-year-olds that she would never let her own sister read. Her video ended with a pledge to only promote stories that included what she called conscious framing, stories that might contain dark elements, but which included authors' notes discussing healthy relationship boundaries, or which explicitly framed the hero's behavior as problematic within the narrative. The video went massively viral and sparked the conscious romance movement on BookTok, which has now amassed over 900 million views. The hashtag is a direct counter-marketing force, disrupting the algorithmic pipeline by promoting alternatives. The industry's response to this pressure has been a mix of resistance and reluctant adaptation. Several major platforms have quietly introduced content flags for extreme material, though these are often buried in settings. More significantly, investor sentiment has begun to shift. The venture capital firms that once poured money into these apps are now facing questions from their own limited partners about reputational risk and ESG compliance, environmental, social, and governance criteria. The once assured path to a massive IPO for these companies now looks fraught. The business model is being reevaluated not on moral grounds, but on financial ones. The potential for future regulation and litigation has made the growth at all costs strategy a liability. This financial pressure has created the most surprising alliance of all. In late 2023, a consortium of former platform executives, survivor advocates, and narrative psychologists formed the Blueprint Initiative. Their goal is not to destroy the genre, but to reform it from within by creating a profitable alternative. They've secured funding from impact investors to develop a new platform with a fundamentally different architecture. Stories are categorized not just by trope, but by their psychological underpinnings. Every story with themes of control or power imbalance must be paired with what they call a companion narrative, a short, accessible essay from a psychologist or relationship expert that provides real-world context. The algorithm is designed to reward complexity and character growth, not just emotional spikes. Perhaps most radically, the platform's terms give writers a larger share of revenue if their stories pass a narrative integrity benchmark that measures for harmful tropes presented without context. The initiative's pilot program launched in Scandinavia 3 months ago. Early data is promising. User engagement is high, but so is user satisfaction on post-reading surveys measuring emotional well-being. Writers are reporting creative freedom they didn't have on traditional apps, where they were forced to follow tropes to survive. Most tellingly, the platform is seeing a high rate of migration from users of the older, more predatory apps. It turns out that when given a real choice, many readers, even those who enjoy intense stories, prefer a model that doesn't leave them feeling anxious and manipulated. But the fight is far from over. The dark romance machine is deeply entrenched, backed by billions in revenue and a global user base in the hundreds of millions. The conscious romance movement is growing, but it's still a fraction of the overall market. Regulatory changes are slow and face fierce lobbying. The psychological patterns these stories exploit are primal and won't disappear. This brings us to the central question we started with. Why did 44% of young adults believe controlling behavior was romantic? The answer is now clear. It wasn't an organic mistake. It was the result of a decades-long, multi-billion-dollar feedback loop. A literary trope was identified, commercially optimized, algorithmically weaponized, and delivered without context to the most psychologically vulnerable audience during their most formative years. The percentage isn't a reflection of natural desire. It's a measure of successful psychological conditioning. The real-world consequences, like the case of Elise Chen, are not bugs in the system. They are the logical endpoint of a model that profits from blurring the line between fantasy and reality, between protection and possession, between love and control. The heroes of these stories don't exist, but the behaviors do. And when those behaviors are stripped of their cinematic lighting and poetic dialogue, they aren't romantic. They're the warning signs on a well-documented path to abuse. So where does this leave us? With a choice. We can accept this as the inevitable price of fantasy, or we can recognize that some fantasies are too costly when their cost is measured in real human suffering. This isn't about banning books or shamming readers. It's about demanding transparency, context, and ethical design from the platforms that profit from our deepest emotions. It's about treating the stories we feed our teenagers with the same caution we apply to the food they eat or the medicines they take. Because stories aren't just entertainment. They are the blueprints we use to build our understanding of love, power, and safety. And here is the final, surprising detail that changes the frame entirely. The most effective tool in the Resistance's arsenal hasn't been technology, law, or education. It has been a simple narrative intervention. The Coalition discovered that the most powerful antidote to the dark romance blueprint was not criticism, but competition. Better, more compelling love stories. They've been funding and promoting what narrative psychologists call secure attachment romances. Stories where the conflict comes from external forces, not internal manipulation. Where the proof of love is not possession but partnership. Where the grand gesture is not a kidnapping but a steadfast choice. And the data shows these stories are beginning to gain significant market share, especially with Gen Z readers. The audience, when given a real alternative, is starting to choose a different fantasy, a healthier one. The machine built on hijacking our wiring can be disrupted by telling better stories. The lesson is profound. We shape this reality with stories. And with different stories, we can shape a different one. So what is the ultimate takeaway from this journey into the heart of the dark romance machine? It's this. The line between fantasy and reality is not a wall. It's a membrane, permeable and constantly shaped by the stories we let in. The power of a narrative isn't just in the reading. It's in the rewiring. We've seen how a trope can evolve into a template into a behavioral script, and a script into a real-life crisis. The 44% who confuse control for love are not a statistic. They are a testament to the profound, and often unacknowledged, power of the stories we choose to tell. This isn't a call to burn books or shame desires. Fantasy is a vital human space, but it is a demand for consciousness. To ask, as both consumers and creators, what are we reinforcing? What neural pathways are we strengthening? The difference between a fantasy that explores darkness and one that legitimizes it often comes down to context, framing, and intentionality. The resistance we documented, the engineers, the lawyers, the creators, the readers choosing differently, proves that change is possible when we shine a light on the machinery behind the fantasy. The lingering question, then, is not about the stories themselves, but about the ecosystem we build around them. Will we accept an algorithmic model that profits by pushing the most extreme content to the most vulnerable minds? Or will we demand an ethical framework that respects the psychology of the audience as much as the creativity of the author? The battle for the future of romance isn't about banning the dark. It's about ensuring that every reader, especially every young reader, has the tools to navigate it. Your awareness is the first and most crucial tool. Next time you encounter a story, whether in a book, a show, or an app, that sells possession as passion or control as care, pause. Ask the simple, subversive question. If I took away the soundtrack, the lighting, and the handsome face, what would this behavior look like? That moment of critical distance is the crack in the machine's foundation. It is how we stop consuming blueprints and start writing our own. The stories we tell are never just stories. They are rehearsals, they are instructions, they are maps. The good news is, maps can be redrawn. The choice of what comes next, what fantasy we empower, and what future we rehearse is ultimately yours. Tell better stories, demand better stories, and most importantly, believe you deserve a love story that doesn't require you to surrender your own narrative. If this deep dive changed your perspective, hit subscribe. We dismantle a different hidden machine every week. Thanks for watching.